welcome back to the Warwick F1 show. Today we are looking at, I guess, the East Asian doubleheader that we've had over the last 2 weeks. Obviously the Singapore Grand Prix last week and then the Japanese Grand Prix this week. We have had another title winner crowned, this time Max Verstappen winning his second world title, but in no less, I guess, anticlimactic, controversial circumstances, obviously with Charles Leclerc getting his 5-second time penalty, dropping in behind Sergio Perez, and then everyone sort of realizing that we'd get full points instead of half points. It was a bit of a weird one. We will also be talking about, obviously, a red flag right at the start with Pierre Gasly coming round the corner to see a recovery vehicle on the track 8 years after Jules Bianchi tragically hit a recovery vehicle in 2014. It's obviously something we don't want to see, and we will discuss sort of why that happened, why there was a recovery vehicle on the track, and how the FIA can, I guess, change that so it doesn't happen in the future. We'll also be looking back 1 week to the Singapore Grand Prix, a race that took a very long time to start, and then when it did, it seemed to be it was like, I saw a tweet that was like, it was the most entertaining, boring race of all time. Obviously, Sergio Perez taking that win. One of the only drivers not to have, realistically, an absolute mare at the Singapore Grand Prix. Carlos Sainz going slow, Lewis Hamilton hitting the wall, even Max Verstappen himself making mistakes. Obviously someone that doesn't do that often. I'm joined with my guest here. I'll introduce my, as ever, co-host Chinmay. How are you doing, Chinmay?
Yeah, not too bad. I mean, we've just had a lot of stuff going the last 2 weeks, and I've only just managed to recover from it, so... Yeah,
I haven't even mentioned, we'll also be looking at the cost cap. The report finally got released. It was revealed Aston Martin went over for procedural breaches, while Red Bull Racing, the winners of the 2021 drivers world title, at least, went over, did a minor overspend, so anything up to 5%, $5.7 million. So we don't have an exact figure, but obviously we need to look at the fallout from that. What penalty will they get? Will they lose the 2021 drivers world title? I'm also joined by a first timer on the show, Yusuf. How are you doing, Yusuf?
Yeah, good to be here.
Yep. And I mean, what was your, I guess, looking at the last two races, do you have any particular highlights that you want to talk about, or what would you say, how would you say they went?
You'd have to say that Red Bull would be very happy with both, and Sergio Perez, you would say, is perfect for a Singapore track, and Max Verstappen is probably perfect for Japan, and, you know, those were the two winners of those races.
Yeah, and we may as well just dive straight into it, obviously, with Singapore. I'll just run through the race results that we had from, obviously, the Singapore Grand Prix. Sergio Perez taking his first win since Monaco, his, I guess, second win round the wet street track this season, again, obviously, with Monaco being that win. Charles Leclerc coming in second place with Carlos Sainz Jr. rounding out the podium for a 2-3 for Ferrari. Norris and Ricciardo fourth and fifth, benefiting hugely from the Yuki Tsunoda safety car that we had in the race. Lance Stroll as well, another beneficiary of that, coming in sixth place. Max Verstappen, an uncharacteristically out of sorts race for the Dutch driver, coming in seventh. Sebastian Vettel climbing from the back of the grid, again sort of benefiting from that safety car as well. Then Lewis Hamilton, obviously seeing another mistake with him driving into the barrier after being just behind Carlos Sainz, and then eventually finishing in ninth. Pierre Gasly finishing in 10th, and then out of the points we had Bottas, Magnussen and Schumacher in 11th, 12th and 13th. George Russell with probably by far his worst race of the season in 14th place. Then we had six non-finishes. So Yuki Tsunoda, as I said, driving into the barrier. Esteban Ocon retiring. Albon again crashing. Alonso again retiring due to engine issues. And then Nicholas Latifi and Guan Yu Zhou colliding at the start of the race to take them both out of it. I'll go to you as ever. We will start with the top 10 finishing, we'll start with the how would you rate the race out of 10? Managed to get the words out there. So I'll start with you, Chinmay.
I'll say 6, because yes, there's a lot of entertainment, but there wasn't a whole lot of there wasn't all that much going on. Yes, we had Verstappen overtaking, then the lockup. But, like I said, I found it's like one of the most entertaining, slightly more boring races of the season.
Yeah. I mean, Yusuf, do you agree?
I'd call it a 7, because it's the sort of race that on the surface is not entertaining in the way that maybe Silverstone this year was, but I think you can find enough nuggets to have a real good time watching that one.
Yeah, and we'll get started right at the start. Half an hour before the race, the heavens decided to open on the Marina Bay circuit, and it led to the race being delayed for one whole hour. I mean, Chinmay, I think general consensus at the time was, why are we delaying it for so long? Why have we not gone out? Obviously, do have the full wet tyres that the FIA seemed to be very against using at any point, and we did have it delayed for 1 hour. Do you think that was too long?
I don't think so, actually. I mean, at the time, yes, I definitely did think so. But then you look at the race, and then it was almost like Turkey in a way, because the climate was so humid at the time. I think it was 80% humidity. The track was just simply not drying until towards really the last half an hour or so of the race anyway. So I feel, to be honest, I think it ended up being a good decision, but I think, like I said, if you ever feel useless, there's a wet tyre in F1.
I mean, Yusuf, do you agree?
Yeah, I agree. The humidity, like you said, and there's no light because of the night race and no wind either, so the track doesn't dry. And Formula One seems to have more of a problem with the visibility rather than the full wet tyres themselves. So it seems like whenever we could use the full wet tyres, the visibility would be so poor that can't use it.
Yeah. I mean, do you think it is something that has come in with the larger tyres, obviously, that we've had since 2017? 2017 to sort of 2020 odd really were without many wet races. Obviously, we had Germany 2018, Germany 2019 was probably the most standout example of a wet race, but we didn't really have any during that period. And then we've got to 2020, 2021 and 2022. Obviously 2021 Belgian Grand Prix washed out. We've now had 4 wet races in one season, which I think is a record or a number that we haven't had in a long time. Do you think it is the larger tyres that are throwing up so much water and making it so unsafe for drivers to race, especially when, obviously, as you say, we are on the wet tyre?
No, I think that's 100% the case. I mean, we look at wet races before, and you compare the wet races today. The spray that those tires make it's just unbelievable. I mean, the drivers cannot even see. I mean, you can't see anything from the cameras, and I'm pretty sure the drivers can't see anything as well. And especially because nowadays the F1 cars have got so much faster compared to, say, 10 years ago. Even though this year have got a bit slow, they're still ridiculously quick. And, you look at the 18-inch tires and stuff, that visibility is not great, especially with the whole thing with the center of the halo. It's a lot more dangerous for the drivers to be racing under those conditions, and especially with 99% of the time with safety being such an utmost priority for the FIA, and other than the one scenario we saw in Japan that we'll talk about later, I'm not really surprising that the wet tyre is kind of just being avoided at really any cost.
Yeah, and Yusuf, we'll bring in Japan now, actually, because it was another wet race that was delayed for an hour or two. We saw at the start of that race how much water was getting thrown up. You couldn't see beyond the first maybe 3 cars on that race. Were you surprised at how little you could see on the cameras, obviously at the start of Japan, because we did get that race started for at least one lap before the red flag? I mean, were you surprised at how just little visibility there was?
A little bit, but also I sort of predicted it towards the start of the year with the new ground effect error rules coming in. Part of that to allow for closer following is that it kicks up the air as quickly as possible when the car goes past, and that prevents the dirty air and means that the cars can follow a little bit closer. But you would think a little bit logically that would probably also kick up a lot of spray too in the wet.
Yeah, I mean, do you think as well that maybe the FIA needs to be looking at, obviously we spoke about it, we spoke about it earlier in the season, but with Monaco, the race obviously being delayed for quite a while there, do you think the FIA needs to be looking at new protocol for wet races? Obviously with it now being, so we've now had 2 races this season that were delayed and either starting or delayed, starting from a standing start, and one where we've had no DRS go on for a while in Imola, and now one where we've had a red flag after 1 lap. Do you think there needs to be new protocol for wet races? Maybe make them start on the full wet tyre if we saw what we had in Suzuka, especially because we were on the intermediates, because they had a bigger operating window.
Yeah, a little bit, but the big constraint is not grip, it's visibility, and, the wet tyres aren't going to help there. In fact, they'll probably make the situation worse because of how well they bring up the water from the track. That's what gives them the grip. So there needs to be some kind of rule change, because we don't want the full wet tyres to be just completely not used, and we also don't want races finishing after 40 minutes with the 3-hour rule. So there needs to be some sort of change. What it is up to the FIA.
Yeah, I
think it is a solution we won't see for a long time, but I can't remember off the top of my head exactly, but I believe they are actually looking to make the wheels narrower in 2026 as part of the new regulations. As long as we're making the car smaller, they're looking to make the wheels smaller as well, or something like that. So hopefully that can probably help reduce the visibility, reduce the water spray, and hopefully improve visibility for at least in the long-term future races.
Yeah, and obviously we'll move it back to Singapore now. We had, eventually when we did get started, we had a Red Bull it was a Ferrari on pole, a Red Bull in second place, and another Ferrari in fourth. Obviously that harks back to 2017 with the collision, the sandwich between the Ferraris and the Red Bull. Were you thinking about that as the race started? Obviously it was very similar conditions, very similar starting positions, and it did seem like it was all going to happen again.
I wouldn't be surprised if it did. I wouldn't have been surprised if it did, but to be fair, they are different drivers. The drivers are much better at keeping themselves out of contact.
Yeah.
So I didn't really see what might happen.
Yeah. Yusuf, did you expect any fireworks at the start, maybe more than we got, or?
We've had a safety car, I think, every year at Singapore, or a virtual safety car, so, turn one's a good a place as ever for a safety car to come out, so I thought maybe, but nothing came of it.
Yeah, and obviously we did see some more virtual safety cars and safety cars throughout the race, and we will dive into that. We'll just take a quick break now, and when we come back we'll talk about obviously what happened during the race, obviously with many drivers on the grid having less than stellar performances, Max Verstappen and his issues in qualifying as well. Now, diving back into the Singapore Grand Prix, and we're going to talk about the stinkers of the race, because there were a lot of drivers that had very subpar performances, and I think we'll go from front to back maybe in sort of how they finish, because obviously finishing third on the podium, Carlos Sainz, but I think, Chinmay, it's fair to say that third place was quite generous for what was an incredibly slow drive.
Yeah, he was a literal Sunday driver for that weekend for some reason. I don't know why, but it was just a complete Sunday drive, while everybody else was just slipping and sliding behind him and locking up. But the thing is, he kept it out the walls, he ended up on the podium, so I guess that the fact that he didn't crash paid off at the end.
Yeah, I guess that is it, Yusuf. He didn't crash, he didn't end up in a wall like so many other drivers, but he was nowhere near challenging his teammate, nowhere near challenging Sergio Perez. He was just sort of sat there a second of a lap slower, really frustrating, obviously, Lewis Hamilton behind him.
Yeah, he was about a second off the pace pretty much the whole way through the race, especially at the start. And I think it's mostly, if you look at it, probably about driver styles to me, because I've always thought of Carlos Sainz as a really classically good Grand Prix driver, in that he's really great at correcting slides and that sort of thing, but obviously in the wet, the best thing is to not get into the slide in the first place. That applies in the dry too, and I think in the wet, Sainz's problem is made even worse by that.
Yeah, well, I think Carlos Sainz was sort of one of the ones where it looks bad but ends sort of good. One where it looks not great and then ended even worse was the driver that was behind him for most of the race. Lewis Hamilton, normally a rainmaster in the wet, but I think it's fair to say a combination of a slow Carlos Sainz, a W13, and then a level of impatience sort of sent him into the wall at turn 5. I think that's fair to say, Yusuf.
Yeah, I think there's 4 main things that put Lewis in an eventual P9, I think it was. I think off the start, he was slightly ahead of Sainz coming into turn 1, but then had to go off the track, and that lost him the place to Carlos Sainz, who he was stuck behind for the rest of the race. But also the Mercedes W13 is famously this year really bad at bringing its tyres up into temperature. But on the flip side, it means that once it gets there, it's pretty kind on them and they can have a good race stint. So that's 2 factors that basically kept Hamilton behind Sainz. Then he hit the wall and then made a mistake trying to pass Vettel at the end that lost him place to Max Verstappen.
Yeah.
Quick one. What do Mercedes make their front wings out of? Because I don't know. We saw it last year as well. It's like, whenever Hamilton hits the wall, is that you see other cars, the entire front wing is just completely demolished. And then you get the Mercedes, it's just like, it's literally just like the end plate just like snapped off or something like that. I don't know how he manages,
that's German build quality.
That's true, but still.
But if you want the technical answer for this, it's because Lewis straightened up his wheel before he hit the wall, so he hit it flat. So it was really good from Lewis there, but, German engineering.
Even when he crashes, he's still goated.
Yeah.
But, Jimmy, I think it's fair to say that Hamilton, there was a level of impatience that maybe led to both of his mistakes. Obviously, the first one with Sainz and the second one with Sebastian Vettel in P8. You can sort of understand it because do you think that he would have been able to hold pace with Carlos Sainz and Charles Leclerc? Because personally, I think he would have.
Oh no, definitely. These are traditionally the conditions where the two of the statistically best drivers on the grid, Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen, this is where they usually shine. In fact, add Sebastian Vettel to that mix as well. Those 3 drivers in the wet on the tradition are some of the best drivers you ever see on the grid in wet conditions. But for some reason, Hamilton and Verstappen I think they just got too impatient because that's what caused Verstappen's mistakes as well.
Yeah, and obviously a very slow W13 on a Singapore track is also not going to help. And we will jump to Max Verstappen now, a driver that was looking good for the race win at the start of the weekend. But then in qualifying, and we don't normally bring in qualifying, but I think it sort of became the defining feature of Max Verstappen's race. Red Bull not fueling the car enough, and he dives into the pits on what is looking like a lap that was going to be about 0.6 ahead of what Charles Leclerc did.
Yeah, Max was looking like he'd be miles ahead of the pace in qualifying, but I think personally you have to put the mistake a little bit to Max as well, because he had at least 2 laps beforehand where he'd got to maybe turn 16 or so before backing off, making a slight mistake or getting an oversteer and not being able to correct it in time. And so you're using up so much more fuel on those laps than just going around the track trying to heat your tyres. So, a little bit of a miscommunication there and put Max in 8th.
Yeah, and it does feel like Max Verstappen is becoming the king of laps that never were. Obviously, we saw it in Saudi Arabia last year and we've seen it in Singapore this year.
Yeah, I mean, it is what it is. He made a mistake, he paid a price for it, and yeah, that's all there is to say, really.
Yeah. And then we dive into the race. Obviously, he does quite well. He gets stuck behind Lando Norris and Fernando Alonso for a fair while. Obviously, I think that again exposing how Singapore, very difficult track to overtake at. Gets past Pierre Gasly suspiciously easily. I'm not saying anything, but that move was quite easy for him to make. And then obviously he pits for a second time, he pits for a second time because he locks up behind the McLarens trying to overtake them. And it's not a mistake you see Max Verstappen make often, is it?
No, not really, but you would have to say it's a little bit more complicated than that. He hit a little bit of a bump on the tyres, and the Inters, this is his mistake a little bit, weren't still fully up to temperature, so couldn't quite get the grip down the inside that he was hoping for.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was just a simple mistake. The tyres weren't up to temperature. He locked up. I think it's just a simple mistake here and right there.
Yeah, and obviously finishing in 7th place, managing to get ahead of Sebastian Vettel, and then obviously it hasn't mattered because he has become the World Drivers' Champion for this year. Dropping a bit further down the grid, I think it's fair to say Pierre Gasly had a bit of an anonymous race. I don't think there's anything really to criticise. Obviously that AlphaTauri has proven to be one of the slower cars towards the back end of the season. The final driver that obviously finished and had a bit of a poor race, or maybe not his fault, partially his fault, but also with the team as well. George Russell, they sent him out too early on the dry tyres. He was sliding and skidding around. He was basically the guinea pig for the entire grid for them to work out when the track was dry enough. I mean, it was quite, that drift out of turn 3 was incredible, him coming out onto the track.
Yeah, I mean, kudos for Russell to actually keep the car on the track still and not crash at all during those 10 laps. Cause it's you got slicks in wet conditions. You see the best drivers completely sliding around. I think
Hamilton in Imola obviously going off onto the wet line and ending up in the barrier. Hamilton, even at this race, onto the wet line and losing the position to Verstappen.
I was going to go back to Germany in 2019. I mean, Verstappen won that race, but he first got into the Inter and he spun, I think, had 2 360 spins during when he first got onto the dry tyres in Germany in 2019. So, the fact that he didn't spin at all, the only thing he had was that one really cool looking drift he had. I mean, and he actually did really well driving despite what the position he was in, and if we take out the collision with Mick, which was just a silly turn move by Russell, to be honest. But
and we will talk about the collision with Mick. Obviously, he said he left him space and was going straight, but I think it's fair to say he was moving quite far right forcing Mick onto not much more of the track, and then obviously they collided. Obviously it was a bit unfortunate that they both got punctures because it is such a small collision between the two drivers.
Yeah, but it happens, I think Brazil 2019 between Leclerc and Vettel, who were teammates at the time there towards the end of the race, shows that even a little bump when one of them pushes towards the other means that they can both have tyres that go off. Leclerc had a puncture and Vettel's tyre basically exploded.
Yep, so obviously George Russell having a bit of a poor one there. And then I think, Yuki Tsunoda just binned it in the wall after being slow. I think that's just a fairly standard performance. It's a standard performance now. He's the only driver in the last 5 races to not score a point. Even Nicholas Latifi has scored points for Williams now, obviously, in Japan, and we'll come on to that as well. But I think fair to say he didn't have the best race in Singapore, did he? After committing, I think, quite a collision on Guan Yu Zhou, and obviously taking them both out of the race.
I mean, it's Latifi. Was it Frederick Vasseur said that sometimes it's the engine, sometimes it's Latifi that causes your DNF. So it was
very prophetic, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, Latifi. It's just Latifi. Just Latifi things. I think that's the only way you can really describe it. Obviously, he did collide with Zhou, and we were watching it in the Oculus, and there was a big sigh of disappointment when we saw Latifi, because I mean, Yusuf, it did feel like the sort of race that would be spiced up by a Latifi incident at some point. Obviously, wet track, and especially with the walls so close together.
Yeah, Latifi loves a crash a little bit, and he said he didn't see him, but it's his job to look in his mirrors really on a straight and before turning in. So Latifi crash and Latifi error.
Yeah, I mean, mirrors do tend to help, don't they?
Yeah, I don't know what's more useless, the mirrors on Latifi and Stroll's car, or just the wet tyres and Giro. I don't know what is more useless.
Does Canada have wing mirror? Have they bought in wing mirrors? Have they exported them?
I'm
to
pretty
Canada
sure they
at
do,
any point?
because I know Canadian drivers are actually decent drivers in terms of you compared to other people in the world. They're generally decent drivers on the road, but
Yeah, Jacques Villeneuve used to say that he didn't believe we should have mirrors on F1 cars. So, there's...
Why does that feel like the most Jacques Villeneuve thing to say? That's somehow the most Jacques Villeneuve thing to say, and I've read a lot of what Jacques Villeneuve says.
Yeah, it's a running theme amongst Canadians, and them and wing mirrors. Don't like them.
Well, everyone dropped a bit of a poor performance there, but there were a few drivers that did well, and we will talk about them after the break. Obviously, Sergio Perez winning the race, Charles Leclerc coming in second. We'll dive into the McLarens as well, 4th and 5th, their best result of the season. But should Perez have kept his win, obviously, with his 5-second penalty after the race? We will discuss that. As I said before the break, we are going to be talking about the better performers from the race. Starting off with McLaren. I think fair to say Daniel Ricciardo benefited quite a lot from the Yuki Tsunoda safety car, but Lando Norris had a very good performance at the race, didn't he?
Yeah, you'd have to say Lando's 4th was mostly of his own doing. It wasn't that difficult, actually, all in all, to keep Verstappen behind him, as crazy as that sounds, But then he didn't pit either before the Yuki Tsunoda safety car, which I think was the 2nd, and managed to come out 4th.
Yeah, and it did see that, obviously, after that safety car, he was keeping pace with Carlos Sainz. I don't know if that's because Carlos Sainz literally was driving like it was Sunday, and he was on some country road in the back end of Norfolk, but... Yeah. Norris, in what is very much a midfield car, probably the 5th fastest car on the grid, maybe, just behind the Alpine, was keeping pace with the Ferrari.
Yeah. I don't know why Sainz decided he was driving a Peugeot and driving on the outside lane at 50 miles an hour, but,
I hate people that, it's just, they're in the inside lane, going any less than 65, then you don't deserve to be on the road.
The worst one, but that's one of the worst things. I hate when people just drive slow on the motorway, but going back to this, but that was a pretty impressive drive by both McLarens. Good to see Ricciardo finally get back in the points, because to be fair, I kind of understand why McLaren dropped Ricciardo, because Ricciardo has just been shocking for the last 2 years. I'm sorry to say that. I love Ricciardo as a personality, but he just had a shocking 2 years at McLaren, and I think he does need a sabbatical. He needs a year out to be able to just refocus, and hopefully he can get that Mercedes reserve role and be the successor for Lewis Hamilton for when he retires.
How Ricciardo won a race will always baffle me over these last 2 years. The only driver out of some Mercedes, Ferrari, or not in Mercedes, Ferrari or Red Bull to win a race was
Esteban
Daniel.
Well.
Oh yeah, I forgot about
Esteban won last Hungary.
My apologies to Esteban.
But that was because of Alonso.
I love Ocon. He's such an underrated driver, and we will talk more about Ocon when we do Japan. But we will come to the 2 drivers at the front that I think it's fair to say had the best races that they could have, Sergio Perez and Charles Leclerc. Perez looking like he's going to rock home to a fairly routine, not routine win, but fairly standard win, not one that's been too difficult. But then we see an investigation pop up, going, was it too slowly behind the safety car?
Yeah,
too much gap?
10 car lengths, and he didn't twice.
And then obviously the race ended, and then a few hours later we find out Perez gets a 5-second penalty, but fortunately for him, he wins by 7 seconds. First off, Yusuf, do you think, what penalty do you think he should have got? Because we were talking about it before we started the show, and you were saying it should have been a bit more than 5 seconds.
By the letter of the law, he should have had 5-second penalty twice. He did it under both safety cars. So, but I was watching the race with my brother, and I told him, look, it's so long as he's got a 5-second. If he had less than a 5-second gap, I don't think they would have given him a penalty at all. And because he pulled out 5 seconds, they could give him that sort of nominal slap on the wrist and let him keep the race win, which they did.
Yeah. I mean, Chinmay, Do you think that's fair? Obviously, a big example of a 5-second penalty changing the race result. We go back to Canada 2019 with Lewis Hamilton and Sebastian Vettel. Vettel sliding off into the grass, blocking Lewis Hamilton as he comes back on track and then losing the race win with the 5-second penalty. Starting off, do you think that they should have made the decision during the race? Because it's not one of those like we did see with Vettel in Montreal that was a bit grey area-ish. It can be seen as a mistake, it can be seen as something else. It's fairly cut and dry how much distance you've left behind the safety car, and he seemed to have exceeded it. So why do you think there wasn't a penalty given during the race? I
don't know. Probably the FIA wanted to see what Red Bull's opinions were and Perez's. But honestly, they should have just made the decision. I don't know why they had to wait for so long to make a decision, because the footage is right there. They can just make it during the race. There's nothing stopping them from making this decision other than Christian Horner literally becoming a Karen once again. But,
Yeah.
Well, I just think they wanted to see the outcome beforehand, and so they could sort of give a slap on the wrist sort of penalty. Yeah.
It's a weird one, I think. It's one of those that it did seem to, I guess, favour Sergio Perez a bit, and especially, and we may as well bring it in now because it does highlight sort of the inconsistency. Obviously, on the final lap of the Japanese Grand Prix, we saw Charles Leclerc get that 5-second penalty for cutting the chicane, gaining an advantage, not losing the position to Sergio Perez. I think it's fair to say that both incidents should have got a penalty. Perez should have had maybe a penalty, maybe 2 penalties in Singapore. Leclerc maybe should have had a penalty for cutting that chicane in Japan. But it was the staggering levels of inconsistency in the time, and then both of them seemingly favouring a Red Bull driver. Well, actually, both of them even favouring Sergio Perez. Obviously, Perez keeping the win and gaining second place in Japan. I think maybe riled a few people up, it's fair to say.
Yeah, it's the FIA. I don't expect anything different. Inconsistency is literally become their forte for the last 2 years. So I don't really expect anything different, from being really honest.
Yeah, and obviously we had 5 minutes in Japan. No opportunity for Ferrari to talk to the stewards, plead their case, and then go to 2 hours in Singapore. Red Bull get an opportunity. Perez gets a penalty, but it's one that doesn't change the result, and it's one that maybe wasn't even correctly applied when it should have been 2. Do you think there is that inconsistency, and do you think that is beginning to frustrate Formula One fans?
Yeah, but I think once it was clear, based on another sort of rule mistake, that Max Verstappen would be the World Drivers' Championship if they gave Charles a 5-second penalty, they were always going to give it. I think it probably was a 5-second penalty, but they were always going to do that, and always going to do it quickly.
Yeah. It's just Red Bull and the FIA causing all sorts of drama over the past few races, and I think it is something that maybe not least to be looked at, but needs to be changed. I mean, Chinmay, do you think that there needs to, again, we're going back to what rules need to be changed, do you think there needs to be that consistency? Maybe just give a time limit for setting incidents, maybe incidents that happen within or outside of the last 10 laps or so, because obviously we need time to have a look at them. They need to be settled on the track, or they need to be settled while the race is running, so we can get a result on the track. And I think that was the thing. Perez, we don't want to change, or the FIA seemingly didn't want to change the result of the win. And if that meant giving Perez a penalty that was less than maybe it should have been, so be it.
Yeah, I think what the FIA really needs to do over the course of the winter break is really just try and have a look and overhaul almost every single piece of rules and technical regulations and just everything in the rule books, just to make sure there's no loopholes or inconsistencies, because the amount of just weird results and just inconsistencies we've seen because of the loopholes and regulations. I know people hate talking about it, but Abu Dhabi is possibly the biggest example we could ever think about with the consistency with the rules. Then we got the whole thing with the points with Spa last year. Then we talk about Japan as well with the whole point system with the so-called, they revised the point system, fair enough. But then, because of the wording in the rules, that even though the race was only just over 50% complete, they ended up still giving full points, which doesn't make sense because the whole point of those revisions was to avoid 19 points for them rather than 25. So and also the things need just to be done as quickly, as an efficiency, and as consistently as possible. But that's just like the complete opposite is what we're getting right now.
Yeah, and it was something that was looked at the start of the season, obviously, with the report into what happened in Abu Dhabi. And I was reminded this by the WTF1 podcast when I listened to it, that one of the sort of proposed revisions to how everything is handled is that we get like a sort of football VAR system where the stewards don't have to look at incidents. We get a team of people that look through all the cameras, present the stewards with the best possible information, and allow them to make the decision obviously a lot quicker than we'd see if the stewards were just making it themselves. I mean, where's that gone? Surely if we had that, you'd assume that a lot of decisions would be made a lot quicker, and we would have been able to see either Perez try and fight out to a 10-second gap rather than the 7-1 that he ended up getting, or Leclerc fight back and prevent Perez gaining that gap. Because obviously, if Leclerc had known about a penalty, maybe he drives differently. Maybe he tries to stay within that gap and eventually take the race win.
I think the only thing we can definitely conclude is that something's not that great at the FIA at the moment, and it needs to be fixed a little bit. Whether you do Chinmay's idea of the sort of rule overhaul or get that VAR sort of team in, there needs to be some kind of improvement, I think. Yeah,
well, that sort of brings us to the end of our Singapore rundown. Obviously, we do want to cover Japan and the FIA cost cap reveal on this show as well. Either of you, have you got any final things you want to say about Japan, about Singapore? Anything that we might have missed out on?
I think I just want to say before we go how good Perez is on these tracks where he can use his sort of great loading up of the rear tyres on the slow corners. Here, this Monaco and Baku, I think we should always watch out for Sergio Perez, perhaps even on par with or above Max Verstappen.
Yeah.
I mean, I think Perez is top of the table on wet races, ahead of Max Verstappen, obviously taking 2 wins, a second place, and where did he finish in Imola? Was he third?
Second. No.
Second?
Yeah, it was Red Bull 1-2.
So 2 wins, 2 second places on wet tracks. Maybe Sergio Perez is the real rain master. We're going to come back after the break and we're going to talk Japan, obviously a race that was a lot shorter than most, a lot earlier than most. I gotta say, after the red flag came out, I did go back to bed and miss it. But no, obviously, watch the highlights. We'll break that down. Maybe we'll talk a bit more about the penalty, about the decision to award full points, and obviously the tractor on the track. We are now going to move Asian countries and dive into the Japanese Grand Prix, a race that was shortened by quite a bit, obviously due to the weather. I'll run through the finishing positions again. So Max Verstappen finishing with actually one of his most dominant performances of the season, finishing in first place, finishing with that win and finishing with the world title in the end. Sergio Perez, as we were saying, coming second after that Charles Leclerc penalty. Obviously Charles Leclerc in third. Esteban Ocon with I think his best performance of the season, coming in fourth place, shortly ahead of Lewis Hamilton, driving arguably the slowest F1 car in living history on a straight. Then we have Sebastian Vettel in sixth, coming back from 18th on the grid after his spin right at the start. Fernando Alonso in 7th, obviously the two of them drag racing to the line. Vettel just pipping Alonso by 11,000 thousandths, that's a difficult word to say, of a second. George Russell in 8th, sort of just in no man's land again with a boat on the straights, which actually would have been useful with the amount of rain. Probably more useful with the amount of rain that was there. The GOAT, Nicholas Latifi, finishing in 9th place, getting his first points of the season, going from 19th to 9th. How did that happen? Because it just sort of, let's dive into that quickly, because otherwise we won't talk about it. How did Latifi finish 9th? Because he sort of just climbed up and then stayed there.
I think he actually had a good start, and he actually set off quite well in the beginning, and then he just managed to stay up there somehow.
Yeah.
In the first race start, he made a few places, mostly by other people going off, like Sainz and Albon. And then he followed the safety car in for Inters on the second start, along with Sebastian Vettel, so that put him up to 6th or 7th, and he managed to keep those places.
Aston Martin just did not know how to release a car safely that race. I don't know why.
Yeah,
they did it twice with Vettel.
Yeah, and I thought they got the second fastest pit stop with Lance Stroll. So swings and roundabouts, I guess, for the Aston Martin team. Lando Norris finishing in 10th with his teammate Daniel Ricciardo just behind in 11th. Speaking of Stroll, he finished in 12th. Yuki Tsunoda in 13th, again continuing his pointless run. Kevin Magnussen in 14th, Valtteri Bottas and Zhou Guanyu in 15th and 16th. But Zhou Guanyu getting that fastest lap. Mick Schumacher in 17th, Pierre Gasly in 18th, and then Carlos Sainz and Alex Albon being the non-finishers, both retiring on the first lap. Alex Albon with engine issues, and Sainz obviously crashing at the start. And I think it's fair to say the Sainz crash was a catalyst for what was arguably the most concerning event of the weekend. So he crashes just before the end, or does that corner have a name? Is it the Dunlop curve or something?
No, Sainz was eventually at turn 12.
Yeah.
So that's far past Dunlop.
So after the hairpin, going out of that, hit a patch of standing water, aquaplaned off the track. First off, Gasly picks up the advertising board in what was like that was a weird one to see. It
was hilarious. Just like, how the heck did he get an advertising board in the front of your car? It was just funny.
I mean, first off, Sainz was incredibly lucky not to bounce out a little bit more. I think it was Lewis Hamilton that was probably the closest, and I can't tell if it was looking at his onboard, I can't tell if it was the advertising board or Carlos Sainz, but he was mightily close to what was quite a big accident.
Yeah, Lewis passed Sainz at 150 miles an hour, inches away, and had no idea Sainz was there.
I mean, going back to that, do you think, and we talked about that obviously earlier with the Singapore Grand Prix, how we did delay the race for an hour. Do you think the race should have started with the level of weather or level of rain that we had? And obviously you could see it on the onboards, you could barely see a thing. Obviously the drivers with actual human eyes and a bit lower down from the spray can see a bit more. But do you think the race should have started?
I mean, I believe it's a hard one because, like I said, there's a risk of waiting for too long so that it's gone too dry and it's not interesting anymore. But then you got the other side as well with the whole safety and visibility issues. So I kind of commend the FIA for at least having a try to start the race in wet conditions, because it's not the first time we've had a wet race. I mean, and actually has had a result, but I feel that the FIA should mandate that at least we should have started in the full wets rather than inters. Because I think those conditions were definitely full wet conditions, but they're definitely not for intermediates. Because you just saw like 4 people spinning and crashing throughout that entire lap.
And obviously, Yusuf, it is an issue with Japan in particular because it is a race that starts in the middle of the afternoon. It's getting into the early evening by the time we do get to the race finish. Obviously, we've seen it's always the iconic shots of the sunset over the fans as the as the drivers come in on dry races. Otmar, I think it's Schaffnauer, the principal of Alpine, said that the FIA missed a trick by not starting the race earlier. I mean, do you think that is something that needs to be looked at? That obviously we can delay race starts, but when we do have large bands of rain coming in, maybe with Japan, with Singapore, maybe even with Monaco earlier in the season, we do need to be starting the race a bit earlier so we can get at least an hour of dry running in before it starts to go wet.
Yeah, that's actually a really good idea from Otmar. But you've obviously got the fans that have come to the track, and how do you make sure they're all there for an hour earlier than they obviously would have? It's a little bit unfair on them, and ultimately I don't think it's feasible for that reason. But it's a good idea.
Yeah, not to mention media channels as well, because they already have that broadcast schedules and everything, and they're under contract with some media, and trying to juggle different timings with the media is not an easy job to do as well.
Yeah. Another potential idea has been as well moving Japan. I know apparently Liberty Media and the FIA have been have been trying to move Japan from its October time slot for a while now. Obviously October in the middle of typhoon season for Japan. We've seen that a lot of times, obviously tragically in 2014 when Jules Bianchi had his accident, we were getting the start of typhoon. We've had a number of qualifyings moved to the Sunday morning, 2019 for example. Do we need to move Japan as well? And I guess why are the organisers so resistant to not having it moved?
I don't know. I mean, it's worth a shout to have it moved, but then what other races do you move? I mean, I think the idea was move Japan sort of April time, so move it around Australia, because obviously, theoretically, and with the drive for climate change, and I'm sure we'll do a show where we talk about the, frankly, ridiculous 2023 grid if you're looking to make the grid as climate friendly as possible. Obviously, if you put Japan near Australia, then it would be a lot better for sort of that sort of thing. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a good idea to do that sort of stuff. But then you got people like Monaco, like the ACM, who want Monaco to stay in May, even though that's like a very inconvenient time, because if you want to do a region base, you have to be flexible with the timings. So it's like, it is a difficult thing to actually master, because organisers don't want races to be at certain times of the year, and then you've got to manage climates in other places. So like Canada has to be around June, July time because that's summertime.
If you did Canada let me see, I'm going to Google what the weather is in Montreal right now, and we'll see if we can do Canada with the other North American races.
I don't know, I think it's a little bit different for Japan and Monaco, because Monaco's always been in May, even if that meant, you know, back in the 60s, it was sometimes the first race of the season because they would only do about 8 races. Yeah. But Japan, for example, in 1889 and 1888, with those big Pro Senna battles, it was the season finale, wasn't it? So,
I mean, do you think that is part of it? Obviously, the organisers want a chance, I guess, at seeing a title winner crowned, and we did see that this in maybe less than ideal circumstances, but we did see that with Max Verstappen. We've seen it with Sebastian Vettel in 2011, and obviously the big Prost Senna 89 and 90 battles. Do you think that might be why they're so resistant to obviously moving it to April time, when the title's definitely not going to be decided by then?
I actually didn't think of that, and I think it sort of shows how much organising goes into a Formula One season.
Yeah. Well, as at the moment, obviously, Japan is at its time slot. It's in October, and it did have rain, as we saw, and then it was Carlos Sainz's incident that did bring out the most concerning, obviously, as I've said, incident of the weekend and especially it was with Pierre Gasly as well, who had pit, obviously, due to his front wing being, I guess, destroyed by the Rolex sign, was coming round the scene of Carlos Sainz's accident and goes at what is a very, very fast pace past what is a very you're unable to see it until he gets right there, recovery vehicle that is back on the track. And obviously that brings up memories of one of F1's, or one of the most recent dark days in F1, obviously 8 years ago, Jules Bianchi sliding off the track and colliding with a recovery vehicle, obviously collides with it, never wakes up, and then tragically dies a few months later in 2015. And it did just feel like it could have potentially been history repeating itself when we saw that.
The fact that we have a chance to learn from history and we don't is not a good thing at all. I mean, and the fact that the FIA puts so much importance into safety, and then you see a massive mess up from like a recovery vehicle on track, and the vehicle was on the track even before the red flag was given. It was just a safety car, and the fact that we saw a recovery vehicle on the track while there were cars still going around is frankly disappointing and shocking. The fact that we should never ever see that ever again.
Yeah,
as simple as that.
Yeah, I think it was pretty awful. And part of what made it worse in the aftermath was so many people blaming Pierre Gasly's speed. So both the Sky Crew and the FIA gave him 2 penalty points and a meaningless 20-second penalty.
So I think the speed one, I think the Sky Crew were blaming him at that point. I think that was completely wrong. He has every right to try and catch up to the field. He was within the rules. I think it was after the red flag. It was at turn 14 and 15, so at Spoon Curve, that was when he got the penalty points from speeding under the red flag conditions, because I think the red flag had barely been thrown as he was passing a recovery vehicle. But it was the fact that it wasn't even that. He's allowed to catch up to the field, but it's the recovery vehicle that's on, not even off the track, where it could be collided with if a driver makes a mistake. It's on the track, it's on the racing line, and it just baffles the mind, especially when we had in the same conditions 8 years ago such a tragic accident happen.
Yeah, and part of the aftermath of Jules Bianchi's death, there was an investigation that basically concluded that there was no sort of safe way for a racing car to crash with something that big and heavy and slow, and it just basically had to never happen again. So people sort of blaming Pierre's speed sort of missed that point, that even if he hit it under 50 miles an hour, it's potentially a fatal accident.
Yeah, I know, I read that one. So obviously, I think it was like, there's no way, or we shouldn't be aiming to make a collision with a recovery vehicle safe. We should be aiming to make a collision with a recovery vehicle impossible by not putting that recovery vehicle on the track.
Yeah. I mean, look at normal road collisions that you see on the road, like cars with airbags, 5-star NCAP safety ratings and everything, but people are still like high risk at even dying at 30-mile collisions with those sort of protection. F1 drivers don't have airbags. They're driving at 150 plus miles an hour pretty much all the time. They're dealing with these like I said, most of the collisions you'll find is over 50 Gs. So it is pretty alarming to see that, that F1's finally not learned from the mistake that cost a driver her life 8 years ago and is repeated last weekend.
Yeah. And who was responsible? Because if the marshals have gone out under their own steam, then it seems like the FIA hasn't got control of the marshals. And then if the FIA sent it out, it's just like baffling how they can't have learned from mistakes that obviously we saw in the past. It was it shouldn't even be there, but the fact that he didn't have, or the recovery vehicle didn't have lights on it, even, that would be the tiniest bit of safety that obviously we shouldn't be having, because it shouldn't be there in the first place. But the fact it would completely invisible to Gasly until about 20 metres away. And obviously at that point, if he's on a collision course with it, there's nothing he can do.
Yeah.
Like, surely, if you're gonna send it out, and don't send it out, but put lights on it, and just make it visible. It just baffles the mind how it hasn't, seemingly no lessons have been learned, and we could have had another really bad tragedy.
Yeah, and Pierre was rightly furious about it for a long time.
I think all of the drivers were furious. I think especially because we had that red flag incident as well, I think it gave time for people to be like, while we're not racing, look at this terrible thing that happened.
Yeah.
I think it's just do you think that we will, because if we haven't learned from 2014, How do you think we're going to learn from this one? Do you think, or are we going to get the same thing happen in 8 years' time in 2030 or whatever?
I'd say if you don't learn from the first F1 driver dying for, I think it was 31 years.
It was, 20 years.
Well,
since,
20 years since Senna and
Senna.
Ratzenberger died in Imola. Then I don't know what you're going to learn from. You're not going to learn from Pierre driving past it, are you?
I mean, Chinmay, there's not much to sort of say apart from it just baffles the mind how it took place.
It's stupidity is what it is. I'm just going to say that there. It shouldn't happen, and it should never happen.
It is crazy how it did happen. Obviously, it's really, I mean, it's disrespectful to the memory of Jules Bianchi as well, that we should realistically be learning from his mistakes. And obviously his father on, I think it was Instagram, said the same thing. It's just like, I genuinely don't know what to add. Do you think surely someone has to be punished for this, because it's such a blatant disregard of any sort of safety and any sort of lesson that we did learn from at the same track as well 8 years ago.
No, it is really unbelievable. I'm hoping that there's a good response from the FI on this. I mean, yes, they're preoccupied with there's a whole nother fiasco, i.e. the cost caps that they're pretty much preoccupied in, but I feel like the safety stuff should be a bigger priority for them right now. They should sort this out right away and basically just fire whoever was responsible.
Yeah, I mean, Yusuf, do you want to add anything just before we go to a break?
No, I'm fine.
It boggles the mind how it did occur. We will take a break now and we'll come back and talk, I guess, more about the ending, obviously, of the Japanese Grand Prix, another FIA fun one. It's just like, it's the fact that something so bad could have happened and it's seemingly not been brushed under the rug, because obviously everyone highlighted it, but the fact we didn't learn from 2014 and the fact that we are now into 2022, you'd think safety has improved, and that because maybe we are seeing all these issues, it's not something that's going to be highlighted even as much as it should have been. But yeah, as I say, we're going to take another break now. We're going to come back, talk about the ending. Should we have had full points? Why did no one realise we shouldn't have had the full points? And then obviously congratulating Max Verstappen on his eventual 2022 title win. We will dive now back into the finale of the Japanese Grand Prix with the announcement of, well, I guess we've talked about the Charles Leclerc incident. I think fair to say that it was a 5-second penalty. Obviously controversy about how quickly it was given, but obviously we've discussed that when we were talking about Singapore. So we'll dive in first to the decision to award full points because no one had apparently read the rules correctly. I think that's the long and short of it, isn't it?
Or even better, they didn't write it properly, I don't think, because
So I think what I read in the end, I read an Andrew Benson thread on this, is that the loophole that eventually, so it was the wording that if the race is stopped and can't be restarted.
Yeah.
I think that still applied before Belgium, and obviously kept applying here, but no one had ever accounted for what if the race doesn't start race starts, stops, but then restarts a few hours later. And that's, I think, where the confusion came from.
Yeah, that's what it is, because at the end of the day, the race didn't finish under the red flag. It wasn't suspended or anything like that. The race actually finished within the 3-hour time limit. And it was under green flag conditions. So I think that's what the loophole essentially is, which allowed full points to be awarded, which really, in reality, shouldn't be. Yeah. I mean, we'll talk about this, but when Verstappen was crowned champion, he was just confused because, even everyone just expected that 75% point system to be awarded, so he would have been given 19 instead of 25, but...
Don't you love it when our governing body knows the rules and doesn't communicate them to anyone, so everyone's just left in the dark, and It's just another mess from the FIA.
My favourite little bit of irony from this was that, do you know who wrote that rule as written that led to the race being given full points?
Who?
Michael Massey.
Yeah,
so it's just
we'll maintain it, but if we ever do our unpopular opinions episode, Michael Massey wasn't as bad as everyone says he was, up until obviously right at the end when he did become quite bad. But obviously it'll be something they'll look at. They'll probably reword the rules again just to close out the loophole, but it's just, the loophole shouldn't have been there in the first place. It's amazing that no one thought of this scenario.
Yeah.
You know what they should do? You know how 5-year-olds are just really curious about everything? We should give a 5-year-old a copy of the F1 rules and let them think of scenarios that might not have been thought of.
Well, I think you could just put a 5-year-old in charge of the FIA and, they wouldn't send a tractor out on track, so, they'd be doing a better job.
Let a 5-year-old be head of the stewards.
Yeah.
It's again just the FIA. I think it's more the fact that they did know, because the timing tower was showing full points for the entirety of the race. Obviously, what would have happened if everyone finishes where? Would Max Verstappen become the title or the title winner? But seemingly a lot of the coverage, the British coverage, I think the French coverage, I think the German coverage might have been the only ones that did actually clock on to what would actually happen, which is very German of them, reading the rules. But you would have thought that when Crofty is going out on air continually lap after lap saying Max Verstappen can't win the title because it won't be to 4 points even if Charles Leclerc finishes third or whatever, you would have thought someone would have sent a little message over to Sky being like, this is the rule, this is the wording, so maybe stop giving people the wrong information.
Yeah, and like you said, on the screens that it was coming up as it stands, it said Max Verstappen plus 25, and so the FIA knew the whole time.
Yeah. Do you think they should have communicated it maybe to everyone?
I mean, it would have been useful, so 100% yes.
But even the teams didn't know.
Yeah, I mean...
Even Max didn't know.
Yeah, Max didn't know, and it ended up being the most anticlimactic Drivers' Championship crowning in possibly the whole of F1 history.
I guess it balances it out, obviously, with last year being arguably the most dramatic, one of the most dramatic title. They will get a third one next year and it'll be really standard.
Please let Max Verstappen win the championship under normal circumstances next year, I beg.
Yeah, well, obviously that did mean Max Verstappen won the title in the pit lane. He was halfway through his winner's interview and they were like, oh, you've won the title. And he was like, yeah, cool. It was so odd. And it's now so we've had W Series be settled by them cancelling the final few races, Jamie Chadwick becoming champion, and congratulations to her on her third W Series title. I think it's fair to say probably time to at least test her out in Formula 3, maybe Formula 2, and see how she can do, because she is a step above everyone else on that grid. We had the F3 title being settled in the pit lane. I think, was it the driver crashed out and then won it? Can't quite remember.
I can't remember. What was his name again? I can't remember.
No, then my knowledge banks have deserted me. F2 was definitely settled in the pit lane as well after a post-race penalty, in F1 now settled in the pit lane with obviously the rules that no one was aware of being eventually sorted out. I mean, Max Verstappen's second world title, and I think it's fair to say a lot less controversy than the first and a lot more dominant. It's very reminiscent of 94, 95 Schumacher, obviously 94 when he collides with Damon Hill at Adelaide. Quite a controversial finish, and then 95 sort of rumps to the title in quite dominant circumstances.
Yeah, I think not much more to say. So, by the way, just go back to Formula 3. Congratulations to Victor Martins for actually winning it. So that was the name I was looking for.
And Felipe Drugovich.
Yeah, and Felipe Drugovich for Formula 2. And also, I think he's now the first junior driver for Aston Martin. So let's see how that goes anyway.
I think that's a good decision from them. It keeps them in the sport, obviously. Here with winning the F2, maybe it's not quite the strongest F2 grid that we've seen this year, but it's a very good performance and well done to Drogovic. And we'll come back to Verstappen quickly. Fair to say this is one of the most dominant title performances we've seen in a long time, even outside of the Mercedes were always quite close together. It was always Hamilton and Rosberg, fairly close, maybe 2015. Then Hamilton had Vettel for 17 to maybe less than 19. 2020 is probably the closest comparison that you can think of in such a dominant title performance from Hamilton, obviously then, and Verstappen now.
Yeah, I think you have to go back to at least sort of 2013 Vettel, if not maybe even 2002, 2004 Schumacher Ferrari years, since we've seen a guy dominate the title this much, really. And that's all credit to Max Verstappen and the setup that he can live with, that his teammates can't live with. And we've seen that from Pierre to Albon to now Sergio Perez. And congratulations to Max. He was phenomenal this year. And Adrian Newey, who was, as usual,
built a literal rocket ship that somehow can go on medium downforce and still be the fastest car on the grid in some wizardry that I'm unaware of.
That was pretty unbelievable.
Yeah. And do you think that, I guess we'll dive into it a lot on our end of season review and obviously how the entire season went, but do you think that he can make it a third? It's very similar. It's actually similar to Vettel's one. So winning the title, first title in Abu Dhabi, second title in Japan. Are we expecting a third title in Brazil next year for Max Verstappen, like Vettel's third title in 2012? Or do you think Mercedes might come back and Ferrari finally getting their act together?
No, if Ferrari do get their act together, I think that we could be on for the championship battle next year. But, it's Ferrari. You put our high hopes up, and then you know what happens next year with them faltering and with their master plan. Mercedes will not be... I don't think so Mercedes will make a step up next year because their car was a complete mess this year, and it's going to take a couple of years for them to catch up. So I doubt they will be very competitive next year. But let's see. Unfortunately, there is no Indian Grand Prix at the moment, so we don't know where Verstappen will win his fourth. But
we need the Indian Grand Prix back on the grid. It's
actually a good track, though.
I know.
Only problem is, as usual, corruption. But
apparently the only track in Lewis Hamilton's F1 career that he hasn't got a podium at. That's a fun fact, I know.
Oh, nice.
So he best finish of fourth, but Verstappen winning his title with arguably not maybe his most dominant display. Obviously Belgium this year springs to mind, but 28 seconds ahead of everyone else after 28 laps, second a lap. It's just, and with that move at turn one, obviously on the outside of Charles Leclerc. Where would you rate that move? Because I want to gauge some opinions here on like sort of the move of the season. Is it up there, or where do you gauge it? Because I've seen people say it's like one of the moves of the decade, and I have slight disagreement with that. I've
heard that, and I don't quite think so. I think the grip around the outside in the wet is much stronger around 1A, towards 1A, and then by the time he gets to 1B, which is the second part of that double apex, he can finish the move easily. Which is not to disparage Max Verstappen's overtaking, because I remember his overtake in Brazil 2016 around the outside of Rosberg in the Senna S's in Brazil. I would say that's one of the greatest moves I've ever seen.
Well, because he's coming from behind as well. It's like when Verstappen and Leclerc were fair, like Leclerc's about a tire ahead.
Yeah,
they were fairly level.
In terms of Max overtaking round the outside in the wet, I'd say you'd put the first one in the greatest overtakes of all time category, and not quite the second one.
Yeah, Jimmy, do you agree?
Yeah, I don't think there's much more to say. Pretty much said it all.
Yeah, I think it's maybe a slight misunderstanding of where the grip is in the wet. Obviously, offline, it's not essentially a rubber flat surface. You want a flat tire, flat surface. You want that, but offline, it got more grip in the wet, and you want to be there as well. Some other standout performance before we go to the break. Esteban Ocon finishing in fourth place, shortly ahead of Lewis Hamilton, who had one of the slowest cars in straight line I've ever seen in my life. I think I think it was either Aston Martin or Mercedes with DRS was about the same speed as a Red Bull without DRS. It's just, they've got such a draggy car. And it was at a track they were expecting to do fairly well at.
Yeah, I mean, the Mercedes did look fairly strong in the beginning of the weekend as well. But then, I mean, the best example was, I think, Hamilton, I can't remember what.
I think it is Hamilton and Ocon.
This was Hamilton and Ocon. This was separate to this was a separate incident later on, towards the later stages of the race, where was it Hamilton had much better traction getting out of Spoon Corner, and then you just, so he was almost side by side with Ocon going over the bridge. But then next thing you know, Ocon is just speeding ahead. Yeah. And it's just so depressing to watch just how slow that Merc is in the straight line. Yeah, and obviously George Russell as well, after one London buff of not finishing in the top 5, that became 2 with 8th place. I think fair to say Mercedes just had a bit of a disappointing performance, and indeed a disappointing 2 races when they were expected to maybe challenge for the win at least one of them.
Yeah, I think they should have been able to challenge for the win at Singapore, and like I said, getting tucked behind Sainz basically meant that couldn't happen. But I think they were probably wrong for thinking that they were going to be anywhere near it in Suzuka, given the medium and high speed corners and the long straight. I think
the medium and the high speed corners are fine. It's more just the top speed.
Yeah,
that
but
really proves to be the problem.
That's true. They're not bad in the corners, but the problem is
they had to run higher downforce. So at Britain, they could run lower downforce because obviously, while Britain does have the long corners, it just tends to be a lower downforce.
Well,
track.
It basically, for the Merc to be a very aero efficient package, you've got to run it very stiff and at a low ride height. And basically at Suzuka, you wouldn't mind having a higher ride height for the straights, obviously.
It's undulating.
So that's part of what makes them so slow on the straight. So yeah, I don't think they should have really predicted themselves that highly around Suzuka.
Yeah, Mercedes poor performance. A driver that had a very good performance, Sebastian Vettel, climbing from 19th or 18th, or actually 20th at the start, obviously getting those 2 positions on the first lap, and then climbing back to finish 8th in the end. Again, probably one of those that benefited from pitting at the correct time, but still a very good performance. And then I think finishing 7th actually as well.
6th, I believe.
6th?
Well,
yeah, he kept the 6th to Fernando Alonso.
Yeah, because Alonso was literally...
the TV direction was appalling on that.
Yeah.
No clip of them side to side. F1 have been using fan cams to show that, and I think that's when it gets bad, isn't it?
Yeah, it's pretty dismal. Just one of the 55, 60 different things that have just gone wrong with the FIA this year. I'm just really thinking.
How many times do we see a race to the finish line? Obviously, Brazil 2019 is probably the one example I can think of with Hamilton and Gasly, but that was they were neck and neck. It was
even then,
cars.
Gasly had it pretty comfortably relative to this. This was unbelievable.
This was inches.
The naked eye couldn't see this.
So I think points on it was the gap between Leclerc and Verstappen in qualifying was 1/100th of a second, which is half a Yuki Tsunoda, because apparently that's the unit of measurement that F1 and we are now using. But a 1,000th of a second, it was 11,000ths of a second. It was so close, and we didn't get to see it live.
Yeah,
which is the disappointing part. Well, we are going to take another break now. Unfortunately, we won't have time to we want to do the cost cap news justice, obviously everything that's coming out with Red Bull breaching spending, Aston Martin also breaching it slightly. What will happen? Where will we go from here? Will Red Bull manage to get their appeal accepted or denied by the FIA? So what we're going to do is cover the cost cap next week, with obviously Chinmay hosting, as it is a non-race weekend. So we're going to take another quick break now and dive into our predictions for the Japanese Grand Prix and make new predictions for the US Grand Prix. Welcome back to the final segment of the Warwick F1 show, and as ever, we are going to dive into our prediction game. We'll do a short preview before COTA, obviously in 2 weeks' time. It's a race that it's always sort of one that's entertaining but never spectacular in a way. I think it's fair to say.
Yeah, I think a few live in the memory, like Kimi's win in 2018, but that was Kimi's last and first win for 5 years, so I think that's the reason it sticks in your head.
Obviously, last year as well, quite entertaining, and Hamilton chasing down Verstappen. And ultimately, you could say every race last year was title defining with how close it was.
Yeah.
I mean, any others that stand out for you?
Not really.
Hamilton won the championship in 2015.
2015, Capgate. We're just adding gate to everything. We just add gate to every drama.
The latest one is Oscar-gate.
Oscar-gate. Piastri-gate. What has the better ring to it?
Oscar-gate? Fiasco.
Oh, Fiasco. That's a small preview for what we're calling this show. We've got a great title. But yeah, obviously COTA in 2 weeks, but we do have to look at our Japanese Grand Prix predictions. So I'll throw it over to Chinmay. What are we saying?
Yep. So unfortunately, if you're listening last week, I was pretty spot on with my Belgian predictions, but
you're still going on about that, are you?
Yeah, I'm genuinely shocked about how good I was, so that's why I'm going on and on about it. But this year, not so good. I predicted a Leclerc, Hamilton, Perez because my third tier prediction was a pretty major one, which exactly didn't happen. And then Will predicted a Verstappen, Hamilton, Russell, but for Singapore. This was for Singapore, by the way. Was this for...
I think it was for Japan.
No, this was for Japan, actually.
So, what? Yeah. So I got 3 points and you got 1?
I got 2 points because both Leclerc and Perez were on the podium. Because Perez was second, Leclerc was third.
So 3v2 there. What were we saying for the 1, 2 and 3?
So, for my 1 pointer was that McLaren would retain fourth in the constructors, but they were dismal in Japan. Whereas Ocon had a fourth.
How many points did they score in the end? So what's the 4th for 12 and then a 7th
for 6,
18 points, and then McLaren literally scored 1.
Yeah.
So, and I think McLaren only led by 4 points in the championship. Yep. So that was.
I think that lead is now not going to reverse.
No.
The Alpine, the new floor in Singapore, they've clinched fourth.
Yeah.
Yep. Then you have, and then your 1 pointer was that Verstappen wins the title.
Yes.
So
nailed it.
So it makes it 4-2. So then now afterwards, I said there was a double points finish for AlphaTauri. I think, and then
they finished 13th and 17th.
Yeah, and then not to mention that 20-second penalty from Gasly, and then you said a Yuki top 6, but like you said, Yuki finished 13th.
Think, looking back on it, and maybe looking at Yuki Tsunoda's run and point scoring finishes, that probably was quite ambitious.
Yeah, that was more of a 3-pointer, if I'm being honest. Yeah. So, and then I said that Verstappen would have an engine DNF while leading the race, but
he did lead the race.
Yeah,
that was the only part of that was correct.
Yeah,
he did have an engine.
Yeah,
he had an engine. And he led it.
There hasn't been an engine DNF for Verstappen since Australia, so...
Oh, if you I keep seeing that shot of the title after Australia and then the title now, and it's like so ridiculous. Yeah. Leclerc's only scored an average of I think it's like 10 points per race since Australia.
Yeah, which is a fifth, So.
It's just poor. We were so close to a good title battle.
Yeah, for like 4 races.
Yeah, enter Ferrari, and then and then your 3-pointer was that someone outside of Mercedes, Red Bull, and Ferrari would get a podium, but no one did.
I was close.
You were close with Ocon 4th.
Close with Ocon,
but you
just needed Leclerc to shunt into Perez at the final. Well, Perez to shunt into Leclerc on the final lap.
So then the score made it 48-45 for me.
Ooh, how many races have we got left?
We've got 4 races to go now.
Ooh.
The US, Mexico, Brazil, and Abu Dhabi. So, yeah. So then, what did you put for your podium, Will?
For our podium,
for Japan.
So it was me and
USA.
We have gone very boring. We've gone Verstappen, Leclerc, Perez. It's just COTA's not like it's not a track that throws up a lot of. It's an entertaining race, but it's not one that will throw up a surprise podium here and there.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know, a Silverstone or a Hungary or Belgium or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, we didn't go much different.
What do you've gone Leclerc?
Well, I think we know the one guarantee is that Verstappen is most likely going to win the race anyway.
He's so good. It's not fair.
Yeah.
I reckon he's probably really annoyed that he didn't win Singapore because he lost that streak of wins.
Yeah. Well,
how Vettel did 9 in a row.
I'm just happy Vettel keeps that record.
No, so I just want Vettel to have all the happiness in the world.
Yeah. Well, he still keeps the record for youngest champion and the 9 weeks win.
Then youngest double, triple, and quadruple champion.
Exactly. Because the record for most wins in the season is really under threat now. Because he got 4 races to go and he's already on 12.
Yeah. How many does he have to get?
He's got to get 1 to equal, 2 to win, 2 to beat.
Oh, he'll do that easily.
Yeah,
exactly.
To be fair, it's what record number of races.
Yeah.
Not my goat. Sebastian Vettel.
Yeah, same. But,
Mine's Fangio. Huh? Mine's Fangio.
Yeah, Fangio was good. We should do a show about the greatest of all time. That won't upset anybody.
Yeah. So, what did you put for your 1, 2, and 3?
So for our 1 point prediction, we've gone for an awkward celebrity interview.
Yep,
it's awkward. It's gotta be not what you don't want to watch it again. Or it's not quite the level of Megan Thee Stallion because that was god tier awkwardness. That was like awkwardness supreme.
No, if something like that happens, I'm giving you an extra bonus point.
But like something like maybe he doesn't get an interview or the celebrity clearly doesn't.
Yeah, I want to see
Brundle
ask about Formula 1 related rap again. Yeah.
Okay. So and then for my, for my 1.2, I went for something that's almost also certain. Ricciardo will wear a Stetson hat at some point during the weekend.
That's like a half a point.
Yeah.
It's basically guaranteed.
Yeah.
No, I think that's fair. We've gone also Ricciardo related for our 2 point prediction. And this is another one where we'll probably look back on it next or in 2 weeks and think, why did we do this? But we said Ricciardo top 7.
Oh, okay. Fair enough. We went for a Haas top 8.
Yeah, go on.
Because
we've both been optimistic there.
Because, Haas home race, so,
Oh, yeah, it is their home race. Not anymore. The Russian Grand Prix isn't their home race anymore.
No, but they don't have the Russian drivers.
We got rid of the branding, the driver, and the track. It was
a
clean sweep of Razel of Russia.
The complete boss is like, they get Mazepin, they get the money, and then the Ukraine war actually was convenient for them, so they could just kick out all the bad drivers.
It was convenient for Haas, not to anyone else.
Yeah.
Before we get cancelled.
Yeah.
And we've gone for our 3 point prediction. We don't know the weather, obviously, in Austin. It's 2 weeks away. You'd have to be God to work that out. So we've predicted the 3rd wet race in a row.
Fair enough.
And I think it's been years since we've had 3 wet races in a row. I think it's been years since we even had 2.
Yeah. Yeah, we're being more optimistic. We're saying that Latifi A doesn't DNF, B he's not last to the finishes, and C he does not crash all weekend long.
That's quite a safe prediction.
I don't think that's that unlikely.
I don't think that what. So not okay.
No.
So what was the first one? Doesn't DNF.
Yeah.
Isn't last to the finishes.
Out qualifies his teammate.
Oh, you're adding out qualifies his team.
Out qualifies Albon as well. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, fine.
That's a 3 point.
Yeah.
All of that to happen. Yeah. I'll so wait, what was it? Run it through again.
So A, he doesn't crash at any point this weekend.
Okay. Are we counting crashes or spins? There's quite a lot of runoff at Kota.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll go crashes.
Yeah.
No crashes.
Then he is not lost to the finishes winning the race. He doesn't so basically he doesn't DNF either.
Yeah.
And he out qualifies Albon.
Okay. Yeah, no. All of those coming through, I think that's a fairly decent 3 point prediction. So I'll just run through mine again, and Chinmay will run through his. So Verstappen, Leclerc, Perez podium, awkward celebrity interview for 1 point, Ricciardo top 7 for 2, and then a 3rd wet race in a row for 3 points. And Chinmay?
My podium was Verstappen, Perez, Leclerc. And then my 1 pointer was that Ricciardo wears a Stetson hat in the weekend. My second one was a Haas top 8 finish. And the third pointer was that basically Latifi has a god tier weekend for his standards, so he doesn't crash at all at any point in the weekend.
I think you've really got low standards for Nicholas Latifi.
Yeah, I don't think he's that bad, if I'm honest.
He scored points.
I think he's probably the worst driver on the grid, but
yeah,
that's about it.
You compared to all the other drivers on the grid, and then
he's not the 20th best driver in the world either.
Yeah, so he doesn't crash this weekend. He's not lost at the finishes. He doesn't DNF and out qualifies Alex Albon, his teammate.
Okay.
Or whoever, or unless Albon someone gets appendicitis again, whoever subs. So
you get appendicitis. Well, surely they remove it, so you can't get it again.
Yeah. No, but if something happens, he ends up getting subbed by Nick De Vries again. Then you know.
Yeah. Okay, so we are done here. Obviously, it's been an action-packed show. Lots to talk about. Next week we are going to dive into all the F1 news that we've missed. Obviously, lots of driver transfers, lots of silly seasons, and as I say, looking a bit more into the cost cap and everything that is coming from that. Thank you to all my guests for coming on. Chinmay, Yusuf, anything you want to say? Just some final words quickly.
I guess congrats to Max Verstappen just one more time for winning the Drivers' Championship again. Thoroughly deserved.
Yeah. Please, no more controversies, Red Bull. We have enough already on our minds.
Yeah.
That's what I ask as a Red Bull fan.
I would say a begrudging well done to Max Verstappen because he's admittedly a very good driver. And to be honest, he's become more likeable this season because A, he's not crashing into people, and because B, Red Bull have become way more dislikable. So it's made him look better by comparison.